Welcome to the Analytics Heroes podcast by Modern Data 101, the one and only platform for all things data products and purpose driven analytics. My name is Abhyuday Verma, Community Manager at Modern, and I'll be your host. Today I am excited to host Matthew Weingarten, Senior Data Engineer at Samsara, with a rich background in building scalable data solutions across industry giants like Meta, Disney, and Nielsen. With a strong focus on IoT data, cloud technologies, and high performance data pipelines, Matthew brings deep expertise in handling complex data sets and optimizing data infrastructure. Beyond his technical skills, he is an active writer on Medium, sharing valuable insights with the data engineering community. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the show.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, yeah, to get started, if you could talk a little bit about your recent projects and the work you have been doing so far.
Yeah. So, kind of like you mentioned in the introduction, I just started recently at this new role at Samsara. I've been here for just over a month now, so still kind of like getting my feet wet. But really, what I'm going to be contributing to as a part of the team here is like we're a core data team at it. Is our underlying mission. And with core data, the big thing with that is helping enable data usage and literacy throughout an organization. And that's definitely a big challenge. I do feel like we have, the right people in place to do something like that, and also kind of like the right mindset in order for us to accomplish that. So with that, making sure that we can ingest and properly surface all the data that we collect, which comes from a lot of different sources when you work in IoT space. You're collecting all this data rapidly and it has to all come into one centralized location. So making sure we can surface all of that and our stakeholders can use it. Making sure that the data is of high quality and data is received in a timely manner, just all those like common data challenges, making sure we can navigate those and really help fuel self-service analytics and things of that sort for all the different teams that we are going to work with as a part of the overall organization.
Yeah, lovely. And in your work at these large organizations like Meta and Disney, you have dealt with large scale data systems as well. Is there something common as a pattern which you see across in all these data sets built for scale?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because previously before I started at Samsara, I worked at these big companies where big data was really ingrained into what they were doing. Like, for example, when I was at Disney, I was a part of the team that was doing clickstream analytics on about a billion records a day of like user event data. So it definitely was big data in the truest sense. But I think at the end of the day, no matter like what the size of the data is, whether you're dealing with, gigabytes or terabytes or petabytes of data, really like the same challenges remain at the end of the day. Things like quality and, dealing with late arriving data and things of that sort. It doesn't matter where you go to, like some of those key challenges you continue to face over and over again. And the experience that you've had with dealing with it beforehand can help enable the success of that going forward so you can get things handled as smoothly as possible.
Absolutely. And also, you have mentioned that you established the value metrics for measuring success across multiple pillars. How to go about defining these value pillars for businesses and how to keep these metrics active and stable consistently.
Yeah, and I think with that, so just to give some background, we're basically what we want to do is create a series of like, North Star metrics is what they typically call them. The pillars of success for which you can measure whether things are performing at a high level or whether there's something you need to reevaluate. So when it comes to something like that, we have to work very closely with kind of like the, key stakeholders in all those different areas. So, identifying who those people are, asking them like what are the things that help kind of like measure whether you think that your area is performing well or not, and then turning that into like actual queries that we can pull from the different data sources that we have to actually, be able to surface all of that. And, with those metrics, just make sure you can slice and dice them on the proper dimensions. A metric is only as successful as the underlying dimensions to give the kind of like the full view of where the performance is and where the areas for improvement are. So by doing that, we allow people to have kind of like a fine grain into seeing, whether things are performing at that level or not.
Yeah, and also here, data quality is quite critical. And that's where the next question takes us. So, what steps do you take to ensure data accuracy and consistency, especially when dealing with complex data sets from multiple sources.
Yeah, it doesn't matter where you go. Data quality is going to always be a part of what you do in data engineering. So, making sure that you just have the proper checks in place so that you can, you can identify, where there's any issues or breakdowns in your pipelines. I think the goal with data quality and kind of like, just observability as a whole is that you need to know about any issues related to your data before your stakeholders do. It's always kind of like defeating or embarrassing, if you could even go that far, to get like those messages from stakeholders saying that they see an issue when you guys should have had the tools in place to see that before. So our goal is to make sure that we have the proper checks in place, just understanding the data at that level to know like what are the primary keys, like what are the different trends that we should be monitoring to see if anything is, highly fluctuating or not. So that when we get those alerts, we know how to action on them and to make sure we can notify people if there's any issues. So just really making sure that the data that we process is of high quality, and if there are issues, we can notify people in a timely manner.
Yeah, right. And data governance also kicks in right here when people get involved. So, as data governance is becoming increasingly important, as a cloud data engineer, how do you ensure security and compliance, especially when dealing with sensitive data?
Yeah, it's really data governance is interesting because I've seen it in kind of like different shapes and forms throughout kind of like my journey so far. We worked really closely with kind of like data governance and legal at my previous team in Disney because when you're dealing with sensitive data, which is what we were when we were processing customer level data, just making sure that everything was properly hashed, or we were only exposing what we needed to, was definitely a lot of discussions and back and forth on like that. And even even in the role that I've had so far, I'm sorry, that's definitely the case as well. Just making sure that you're abiding by all the different laws that are in place. There's of course the famous GDPR, and there's all these like smaller ones depending on where you're operating. So you got to make sure that you follow all those because people don't want to use data, and they don't want to provide their data to companies if they're not going to be sure that it's properly compliant. So you got to be able to abide by those guidelines to build trust in what you're doing.
Yes, and this also becomes a very core part when you build your career as well. And that's a journey. As you mentioned, it has been in your previous role and in the
Yeah,
current
I
role.
mean it's definitely evolved. I can think back, and it's crazy to say that, but just because based on that I've been in the space for as many years as I have been, even though it doesn't feel that long to me. But I can rewind like 5 years ago. I think that's like the first time I ever heard like a mention of GDPR, and I remember kind of like some of the, I luckily I didn't have to be as strictly involved in that, but I remember different teams scrambling on that, like, oh my gosh, we weren't doing any of this before. Now we have to do all that. Now, if you're not doing that, you're already way behind. So it's good to
Yeah.
see that we're all kind of like really involving ourselves in that journey.
So, coming to your take on how to grow as a data engineer, the first question is popular public's opinion, and they wanted to ask you this: where if you were starting your journey in data engineering today, what fundamental skills would you focus on first, and how would you build on them?
Um, so my background is it's probably maybe it's conventional. I'm not exactly sure, but when I started in my first role at Nielsen, I was actually, technically a software engineer because that's what a lot of people are when they come out of, university. There aren't like, at least there weren't back then. I know it's starting to grow a little more, but there weren't really like very strict like data engineering or data science focuses because those were kind of like niche. And at the end of the day, it was all about software development and programming,
Yeah.
and I think that worked for me. I think having the proper background in software engineering can really prepare you to be successful in data engineering. Yeah, sure, there's plenty of data related skills that you have to pick up along the way, but at the end, you still need to have like some of the core concepts from software engineering to be successful. Now, I'm not going to say that's the best advice. I think it works, but there's a lot of good resources out there to get started as a data engineer. If I had to, if I had to sell somebody like one book and one book only, Fundamentals of Data Engineering, which of course is like the famous book at this point, from Joe Rice and company. So that gives a really good overview of like a lot of the core concepts in data engineering, and I think that helps kind of like prepare you for what's to come because you know even that book could have been written 5 years ago and it would still be really relevant today. There's so many different challenges, and the data space evolves so quickly, but at the end of the day, the core things that we work on are just outlined in that book very, very well.
Yeah. And that's really beautiful about data engineering because it requires a good balance between programming and data modeling skills. So
Yes, I mean, you definitely need to be, you definitely need to know how to do proper data analysis, and you need to have your background in SQL and things like that. But if you don't have the proper software and engineering practices in place, it's going to be a challenge to really contribute successfully. So having a proper balance of both enables you to be successful.
yeah, absolutely. And this brings us to the question that how would you advise new data engineers to build proficiency in both these areas, programming and data modeling? And which do you think is harder to master?
Which one is harder to master? That's a tough question. I feel like data modeling is always a tricky one because there's no right answer to it. I mean, I guess there's no right answer in programming either, but it's pretty, when you have a pretty successful implementation. With modeling, it's a challenge because, you have to build for what you have, and you also have to build to anticipate future challenges that are going to come along the way. Data models change very quickly based on different requirements, and you need to make sure that your models are scalable and flexible to work with that. You have to make sure you have a design where it's efficient, and at the same time it's easily usable by stakeholders, and those two things don't necessarily intersect really well, because you have to consider that they may not be as like SQL savvy as everybody else. So when you're dealing with like these complex data structures, which are really becoming a part of like our tables now, making sure that they know how to actually properly query that is a lot more challenging than before. So there definitely is a balance. Modeling is not something you can learn overnight. There are some really good resources on it. Probably, everybody in their background has taken, database classes before. And there's a lot of good, there's like one famous book, and I'm forgetting the name of it when it comes to kind of like, the database designs, but it's gonna come to me, and I'm gonna think about it afterwards. But like that's a good resource to get started. And even then, I think saying that you can master that is that's just not true.
Yeah, and also this made me wonder, and I got a question. Could you share a challenging project where you had to balance legacy infrastructure with the modern cloud solutions? Because and the approach and the transition that becomes tricky here.
Yeah, definitely migrations are a part of a lot of what we have to do. And, maybe what we consider legacy before, we would say is now modern, but in a few years, that's going to be considered legacy as well. That's kind of like the fun that comes with all this. The migration projects are, they're not everybody's favorite work, but they're interesting, and they really allow you to kind of like really learn what this new platform is like, and to make sure that you can really get as much out of it. I think there was a project that I worked on when I was at Nielsen where we were moving kind of like this legacy kind of like data for kind of like connected TV. All the applications aren't like just classic cable, so Netflix and everything, which that was, we were running that kind of like on just local data servers and everything before, but this data was really growing because now that's how everybody consumes, TV. So we needed to make sure that we designed it for big data. So moving all of that into the cloud, taking advantage of platforms like AWS and Databricks and everything like that, that was certainly a lot of what we had to do. And now we consider those things to be commonplace. And in a few years, that's going to be outdated too. So just making sure that you can really stay up to date with what are the current trends in data engineering, which that's one of the biggest challenges I feel like that there is for data. The data space as a whole is just how quickly this space changes. You can use the tools that you have now, but you need to know what's out there on the horizon, because you always want to know what the good alternatives are out there. There's plenty of cool things coming up in this space, and I'm sure over the next few years, a lot of people are going to start to gravitate towards those.
Yes, absolutely. And also, when exploring these new tools, many people tend to choose the other one or they choose the preferable one, and every now and then there's a new tool coming up. So, how can data engineers assess the fitness of these tools for their projects?
I think the best way is to just really be proactive, and to and just find the space to kind of like try this on like, just like small experiments, really, more than anything. I think a good example of this is, DuckDB, for example. DuckDB, for those who are unfamiliar, is kind of like it's very performant, and it can do like what some of the bigger machines in the cloud could do on your laptop, and it can query data at a really fast rate. Now, is that going to be good for production workloads? Oh,
Keep going. Not an issue.
okay. Okay, so that's not necessarily going to be good for production workloads, but when you're doing local testing and working on smaller sets of data, why waste your time, putting together, these really big, kind of like clusters in the cloud if you can do it all locally? And DuckDB is a good tool for that. So evaluating, those alternatives and building a use case for why you should use it. And when you present that use case, I think the main thing to mention with that is how long a time would it be to like do that migration? Because in the data world, people like to move fast. Everybody likes to move fast. That's just the fact of the matter. So you have to enable the things. You have to start achieving, small wins, and then at the same time build out the longer term projects and provide a proper use case with the reasoning for why you should be doing that to hopefully get that justification to so you can actually work on that. So there definitely is a balance. I mean, if we could work on tech debt all the time, we certainly could, but there's a lot of different business projects we have to knock out along the way.
Yeah, and also, could you share a project from your career that really solidified your understanding of data pipelines or data modeling when we go and choose these tools? That has to
Yeah,
be
I feel like
solid, yeah.
kind of like that migration project I was alluding to was really kind of like my first exposure, really starting to understand, a lot of the key pieces of like what data engineering is today. Because, I was kind of like given like the lead role in that project. So from that, I was able to, start designing, what the pipeline would look like. So, hey, here's where we need to ingest the data. This is where we'll run all these various transformations. And at the end, this is where we're going to load this, to our downstream stakeholders to use for your use cases. So really getting to design it and seeing the whole big picture allowed me to get that exposure. And I think for anybody, that's a good starting point, is just really to be able to build something. All the time now people talk about personal projects and doing these small things to really get them that practice. I think it's definitely good if you can find an interesting data set out there that you want to showcase. There's first of all, there's no shortage of data out there these days. You'll be able to find that. So just to start with some small use case to collect something, transform it, and then present some cool visualizations or whatever you'd like to do on top of that. That really gets you that preparation in order to do what you'll need to do next.
Awesome. And what are the top three aspects you believe are lacking in the current analytics stack, which make the day-to-day of data engineers challenging?
Huh. What are the top three challenges that I see that are preventing data engineers from like reaching their full potential? I guess is
Yeah.
kind of like to rephrase your question.
Mhm.
Um, that's a good question. I feel like one thing I could definitely think of off the top of my head is just making sure that you have a always consistent toolbox at your disposal. Sometimes the tools that we work with can be a bit janky. Sometimes they'll work very smoothly, and the next day you're just having issues because something like AWS or Databricks or whatever. And I'm not just using those tools because they're the ones that cause the most trouble. They're just the ones that first come to mind. But just dealing with other outages and things can delay testing. It can slow down efforts, and it can make things challenging. So that's definitely one. Just having more consistent tooling, which I think everybody would like if they could wave a wand, but unfortunately, we're not capable of doing all those things just yet. Making sure that you have a way to easily properly test your data like locally, I think is definitely a challenge. Everybody knows having a proper like separation between like a development or a UAT and then a production environment so that you can test these changes out, whether it's on live data or just a small and accurate subset of the data. Making sure you can have that in place before it actually rolls out into production. You'd be surprised at how difficult something like that can be to set up. So just making sure that you have that as a starting point to, separate all of that can be really helpful. And then last but not least, like the biggest challenge that I see is just making sure that kind of like, that the data team is properly intertwined with everybody else throughout the organization. It's challenging. I feel like I've faced that challenge in different roles, and it's starting to get better. But at the same time, it's not necessarily perfect. Is making sure that the value of what the data team can provide to everybody else is ingrained alongside as much as kind of like the product engineers, the software engineers who build those tools, and everybody else. Sometimes they kind of like think of us as like some separate team that just does some magic in a lab, and they're like, hey, here's your data. But we're more than that. We need to work with them very closely, and so to embed ourselves into kind of the organization is definitely a challenge that we need to overcome in order to really reach our full potential.
Yeah, that was actually beautifully summed up because it contains so much value where different teams need to talk to the data teams, and it often
We all need to work. We all need to work together at the day.
yeah,
At the end of the day, we may not necessarily speak the most common language because we think of things in a different way than they do, but we can use each other to really make sure that we're all as successful as can be.
absolutely. What emerging trends or technologies in the data ecosystem are you excited about right now?
Yeah, it's constantly evolving. And what I say now, if people watch this like a year or two later, they're gonna be like, What's this grandpa talking about?" Because it's gonna become so outdated. But I mean, I think right now, how generative AI and LLMs are getting kind of like embedded into what we do is going to be really interesting. Of course, you have to take all that with a grain of salt. I think everybody wants to leap right into generative AI. A lot of companies, when Chat GPT and tools like that first came into being, they didn't really properly evaluate everything beforehand. They're just like, oh, we got to do all these different things. But at the same time, not everything is necessarily there yet. But where you can see the use cases for how that could be successful, you definitely kind of like want to put that into what you do to help make your life easier and then everybody else's life easier as well. I think a good example of this is kind of like when it comes to like data cataloging tools, building kind of like a chat assistant or some LLM that can help, that can really like read into the catalog and find the right data sets for people, which is definitely not an easy task. When it comes to like working in like the bigger kind of like data spaces, you'll see, there's a lot of different databases that have similar data. So to make sure that it's properly trained to grab the right things and answer the right questions, that's not easy. So it's cool to see that there's tools like that that can do that for us. And they're not perfect, but if they can provide things very successfully, why not use them as much as we can, right?
Yeah, and also the communities are buzz with this semantic and logical modeling thing as the future of data modeling. So, have
Right.
you implemented it, and what are your thoughts on this approach?
I wouldn't say that I've fully kind of like developed something like that. I think a lot of what we're trying to do right now is building a semantic layer on which those things can hopefully properly be grabbed. I think semantic layers are becoming very kind of like common at this point, and it's good to see that. I mean, you want to make sure that what you're doing is properly represented at the right business level. So to put that kind of like put that language on top of everything that we do is important so people can grab into that and understand like where is this data actually being housed.
Yeah, and also as the data engineering stack develops, do you see it becoming easier to understand the impact of a data engineer or their team's function on the key business KPIs like the ROI or ARR, and how?
um yeah, I mean, I think really as we see kind of like how the software and product and data teams overlap, how they contribute to that. At the end of the day, maybe we're not necessarily developing everything that goes to the front lines, but if we're I mean, we have to be able to collect that data. We need to be able to collect it efficiently. We need to, I think the success of what we do is measured by how people are able to use our data to help, build the future success of an organization, right? So, you know, if people aren't able to get the right insights and they're not able to get the right insights in a timely manner from our data, then we're not then what we're doing isn't necessarily as impactful as people who are able to do that in a seamless manner. So, when we're able to do that and companies are able to take the right decisions and choose the right outcomes based on all the evidence provided to them, that's when we know that we're successful. So, maybe it's not necessarily as easy to see based on pure sales figures, but you know, when things are trending in that direction, just based on various teams performing at a high level and helping enable the success of a organization as a whole, that's when that data was a part of that.
Yeah, and also as you have already mentioned, another community favorite is catalogs. So, do you think they have made the lives of data engineers simpler in terms of resolving those piled up requests?
Yes, I think the key thing when it comes to a catalog is to hopefully reduce the amount of kind of like ad hoc requests that you get, and getting all the questions all the time, like, hey, where is this, or where can I find this information? That's what a data catalog should be able to provide. And it is a lot of maintenance work to document all of that and house all of it in one place. But if it makes your life easier in that you can spend more time developing and working on various things other than having to answer questions every 5 minutes, then there's a lot of value to that. So those tools are very good. They're also constantly getting better as well. So it's good that everybody's trying to lock onto those, whether it's the vendor solutions or the ones that are now built into the tools that we provide. So it's good to see that everybody's kind of like latching onto that and trying to use that to really just, do a lot of kind of like self-service data related needs.
Yeah, and how do you think the data engineers can future-proof this data infrastructure for handling the complex or PII datasets with all these things put in?
Um, I don't know if anything can ever really be future proofed in the sense of data, because what we think is future proofing now, yeah, that's going to quickly be proven false. I feel like in just a few years. That's the way it always goes. But what you can do is kind of just be aware of what's on the horizon. Really, work with the different teams who will be using this, and make sure you're communicating with everybody to know like what might be coming down the pipeline later, so that you can adjust for that. You never want to develop something that's just to answer that task and that task only, because when you do that, people are going to be like, hey, that's cool that we have this, but can we add that? Then you just add more work onto yourself. So designing things to be scalable and designing things to be flexible with changing requirements, if you're not doing that as a data engineer, you're just digging yourself a trap.
Mhm. Makes sense. Have you heard about or worked with data products?
Um, I mean, I think everybody works with data products in a sense, like at my previous experience at Disney, there I was really strictly working on like clickstream data and helping enable that for kind of like some of our different stakeholders. So building products off of that helped kind of like really simplify their use cases, was a part of what we do. Now, at Samsara, I'm kind of like a core data team. So maybe we're not focused on, just one product specifically, but we have smaller pillars where we build all these data sets on top of that to answer the questions within that. So, building data products is definitely a part of what we do on a regular basis, and it's how people can, find answers to various use cases based on everything that's already out there.
Yeah, and this also is a buzzword in the community because it's not a very fine definition. So, according to you, how would a typical data engineer understand or build data products?
When it comes to building, I mean, there's a lot of good kind of like I wouldn't call it documentation, but there's a lot of good blogs and articles out there on data products. I think to really implement that, you need to start by first of all thinking of what different products you can build out of the data that you have, and then work closely with the stakeholders who are most interested in those data sets to help understand what they're interested in, and then go off and start to try to build something like that, and just constantly work with them, gather feedback, and then modify that as needed. I think that's the big thing is, you can't build a data product in a siloed effort. It's something where you need to work as a greater team to make that as successful as it can be. And you have to work closely along with people who are going to be using that to make sure that it's a proper implementation.
Yeah, and what fine details would a data engineer look for in a good data product, according to you?
I think the key things with a data product is, can it easily answer my questions? Is one, like, making sure that things aren't just used by that team necessarily, but can also be used by other teams as well. Is it? I know I've used this word so many different times throughout this interview, but scalable is something that you can carry over to everything. So,
Yeah.
when something is scalable and when it can be used, quickly to, answer questions so that you can focus on other things, like that's when something is, that's a good product.
Yeah, and when we come to the consumption part of a data product, how do you see data consumers like domain analysts benefit from data products?
Yeah, I think that they benefit from products because they are the ones who are using that data directly. I mean, we don't want to necessarily have to do all the data pulls ourselves. That's you want to have people have, a high kind of like data level acumen to be able to do what they need to do. So, putting all that data in places where they can use that, and then providing them the toolbox to allow them to grab that data is key. Whether that's your team building the dashboards or whether that's providing them kind of like the tools to help build those dashboards, it can go either way. But doing all those things and just helping build like that business and data level acumen for everybody, I think is critical.
Yeah, and that brings us to your knowledge on what are the go-to resources or communities for staying updated on the latest developments in analytics tools and tech.
Yeah. So I think one thing that I'm really big on as a data engineer, and I think a lot of people are as well, hopefully. Especially given kind of like, what we talked about here is just how fast kind of like the data space changes. There's a lot of good resources out there. One thing I do every week is I go through the Data Engineering Weekly, which is a good publication out there for those who haven't seen it before. I'm now trying to remember who it is who actually puts that together. I'm blanking on the name, and I'm sorry to whoever that is, but that's definitely a good resource that I like to keep up with. There's a lot of good company blogs out there. I think companies, for example, kind of like DoorDash and Meta and others that are kind of like Spotify and companies of the sort who are kind of like on the cutting edge of data engineering. Those are good places to read about what they're working on and just to see where you can take ideas. Because a lot of nobody is ever working on anything in isolation when it comes to data, and what people are building now can help a lot of people down the line. So just staying in the know about all the different trends that are out there, I think, is really important.
Yeah, because outside of work, what kind of a person you are also gets impacted on what work you are doing because it keeps on rotating in your head. So, blowing off a little bit of steam and moving to the next section, we would like to take you off the data section and moving into your life. So, uh, outside of work, you're involved in sports and music. How do these hobbies help you maintain balance in your life? And do you ever intersect these with your work?
Uh, Well, I wouldn't say I'm necessarily. First of all, one thing that I would say is for Data Engineering Weekly, which I had just shouted out in the previous question, that's written by Anand. So I wanted to give him the proper kudos for that. I didn't want to miss his name, so apologies for whiffing on that before. But Anand's publication is top notch. Now, going back to your question about kind of like my life outside of work, I would say that I don't necessarily have a life outside of work as much as I would like. That's a work in progress for me. But yeah, I think, going to concerts, watching sports and getting outside whenever the weather's good, which is definitely a struggle in Seattle, because winter weather can be so depressing. But whenever we can do that to just blow off some steam and kind of like separate ourselves from everything else that's out there, that's a good way to unwind. And at the same time, that's also a good way to kind of like just clear your head. And you'll think of things just on, when you're going for walks and bike rides or hikes that you wouldn't have thought of before, but with a clear mind and kind of like just, having some time to really meditate, that kind of actually helps unlock a lot of different things for you.
Yeah, and here's a very interesting question which I really like to ask everyone who comes here. If you could have any superpower to help you at work or in life, what would it be and why?
Or is it any superpower I could have? I think the ability to kind of like slow down, to freeze time, I think would be the superpower I would want, because it's tough to do everything you would like to do when there's only 24 hours in a day, and when we're working, there's only however many hours that is. So the ability to just kind of like freeze time and slow things down a little bit just to get that much more done each day, I think would be key.
Yeah.
Or if it's not necessarily freezing time, if there was the ability to kind of like just expand a day to more beyond 24 hours, that would be great. But I
Yeah.
know those things aren't possible and we have to deal with what we're given, but one could hope.
Yeah, dreams are beautiful, as they say. And now, bringing you to the last question, what's a non-work related goal you're working on right now, and how do your hobbies keep you motivated to pursue it?
My key hobby outside of work, there's a card game called Bridge. For those who have ever played a game, like have played card games like Hearts or Spades before, they're very similar. Bridge is a little more complicated. And Bridge is actually is a useful game for your mind because it's not just about luck. It's also about kind of like critical thinking and logic and all those various things. I've been playing Bridge since I was 13, which That was an eternity ago because I'm old, but it's been a good way to kind of like keep my mind sharp, and it's just a good way to give me something to do outside of work that keeps me competitive. So
Yeah.
I travel to tournaments, during the year. And my goal is to always be as good as I can be, and to, win how if I can, however much I could win. I would like to win everything, but not everybody can. So
Yeah.
just training myself to be as good as I can be and go out there and play as hard as I can, and then see what the results are. I think that's something I always strive for. So it gives me something to continue to work for outside of work.
Yeah, keeping hobbies on your toes keeps us interesting. That's what my mom
Yes.
used to say. Lovely. So this has been a wonderful time with you, Matthew.
Thank you so much, Abiude, for having me as a part of this. It was a pleasure to participate, and looking forward to this and then the future talks that are coming up as well.
Yes, thank you for being here, Matthew. Hope to see you soon. Thank you for joining us on season 1 of Analytics Heroes. For more information, visit moderndata101.com, or you can also find us Analytics Heroes on Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcasts. Click subscribe so you don't miss any future episode. And on behalf of the team here at Modern, thanks for listening.